Good afternoon. It's always a mystery how you'll be introduced, and I think that's the first time that my chickens have been a part of it. So thank you very much, Gustavo, for both inviting me and that great introduction. I'm looking forward to talking to you about cognition and mood disorders. Congratulations on the beautiful new building and auditorium as well. I know that this is a rather new complex, and it's nice to be able to present here. My training is in clinical psychology and in neuropsychology, and I kind of consider myself a cognition researcher more than a schizophrenia or mood disorders researcher. So I've been lucky in the past 10 years since arriving at Queen's to take some of the earlier work I was doing, linking cognition to disability and trying to treat cognition and reduce disability in psychosis to the mood disorders spectrum. So that's been a really nice kind of career shift for me in the past 10 years. And we're going to show you some data that we've collected to try to build a model of how we might be able to understand how cognitive impairments in depression might lead to long-term disability or difficulty in functioning across several dimensions. Just some of my disclosures. One particularly relevant today might be that in my cognitive remediation programs, we use a lot of different types of software, and some of these companies give us the software at no cost, but I don't have any personal financial relationships to those companies. So why do I want to study cognition and mood disorders? This is a quote that we had at the baseline assessment of one of the very first people I was working with when I started doing cognitive remediation and mood disorders. And it struck me that it wasn't only the idea of attention and memory, but how that impairs daily life and how the person with depression who's experiencing some cognitive issues is likely to also avoid activities that are going to be perceived as being cognitively challenging or complex. And it made me think a lot about how we do cognitive remediation and depression and whether we can just simply do it the same way we did it in traumatic brain injury or in schizophrenia. The other reason that I wanted to study major cognition and depression and mood disorders is because it is becoming a very hot topic. I haven't updated this slide in the past couple of years, but you can see the real acceleration in the number of studies that have focused on cognitive impairments in mood disorders, catching up perhaps to what we've seen in schizophrenia and in bipolar disorder in the decades preceding that. Cognitive impairments in depression are pretty mild to moderate when we look at group means. So these are Cohen's d or effect size units. And when you see an effect size of about 0.4 or 0.5, we're talking about a degree of impairment in the group that is not like what we see in dementia. It's not like what we see in schizophrenia. So it would be considered to be mild to moderate across a number of domains. But a number of studies suggest that even during periods of clinical remission, many people with mood disorders will continue to experience some challenges in their cognitive abilities. This is a study that, for some reason, doesn't get cited enough. It's a brilliant study by Judy Jager's group doing a 6-month follow-up, and I think even a 2-year follow-up as well, looking at how cognition at baseline and how changes in cognition over time predict long-term disability for people with depression. And it's really one of the only studies that is focused on looking at the development of disability in depression. And so these are enormous odds ratios predicting disability, both from baseline cognitive abilities and then the person's cognitive ability when they are assessed at 6 months and 2 years later. So we can see that even after we statistically adjust for the severity of depressive symptoms, cognitive impairments are still a major factor when it comes to whether or not a person with depression becomes disabled over a period of time. And it's that disability or that self-reported functional impairment that we think is going to be really important when we talk about why is cognition such a critical factor in recovery for people for depression. So this is the well-known study by Mark Zimmerman showing that among those people who would be clinically assessed to be in remission based on their Hamilton Depression Rating Scale scores, about half of those people do not self-identify as being in remission. So we can use the Hamilton as a structured rating scale and determine 50% of people meet criteria for remission, But half of those 50% don't actually acknowledge that they are themselves in remission from depression. And what is it that people with depression talk about when they think about what's important to define their own recovery? We can see that the severity of their depressive symptoms actually comes pretty low in the ranking relative to some of the other factors that we might consider to be things that aren't necessarily our typical treatment targets. The presence of optimism and self-confidence, feeling like your usual and normal self, returning to your usual level of functioning at work, home, or school, feeling in emotional control, and participating in different types of relationships. And so one of the questions that I have is, to what degree are those continued cognitive impairments predictors of these factors, these first 5 factors, which might have a heavy influence from cognitive disability? These are data from a very large study looking at long-term outcomes using both self-rating scales and missed days at work. So this is the number of sick days for people who were in partial remission of depression versus those who were in complete remission from depression. And you get some very nice statistically significant differences if we look at work outcomes for people who are in remission or not, or partial remission. The problem with these data are that the authors concluded that the patients who are virtually symptom-free were functioning normally. But you might ask yourself, is having 1 sick day a week a normal level of functioning? And so we focus on what it means to have this statistically significant difference between people who are in clinical remission or not. But when we talk about normalization of functioning, this is where a lot of people with depression talk about their cognitive issues still getting in the way, not being able to return to work, or, of course, the nice term of presenteeism, people returning to work but not being able to function at work the way that they used to. Similar data here from a study by Adler looking at whether or not people who achieved clinical remission longitudinally were able to recover some of their work abilities. And you can see in the short term that people who have remission from depressive symptoms do in fact have a reduction in some of the work limitations, particularly those that involved interpersonal or mental or cognitive abilities. But then over time, those people who achieved a remission actually return close to those who only had partial or no remission. So what I want to talk to you about for most of the rest of today is, how is cognition a factor in some of these important factors that those with depression have identified as being barriers to defining their own recovery? And I know when I talk about cognitive remediation that many people in most of the audiences where I present have a different idea of cognitive remediation than what I have. You might have, if you've ever searched in Google for cognition or memory problems, you've probably been bombarded with advertisements from some of the companies that promote brain training. Right, so this is a picture from the company Lumosity, and if you think that a person with depression is going to be given a laptop and sit in front of it with that expression on their face, and that posture and excitement as they hear wrong, 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 when they're doing a cognitive training task, you're wrong. So this is not what cognitive remediation is. It is not simply giving somebody a computer or a tablet and saying, come back in 12 weeks and your cognition will be better. One of our patients said to us, it took me a long time to believe you when you told me that it was okay to make mistakes and that challenges were good for me. People with depression don't approach making mistakes with this kind of look on their face and posture. They really internalize it. And what we've seen for some people is if they're doing the activities at home but not coming in to see the therapist, they start to have a lot of negative reactions and they internalize some of those cognitive deficits. We do actually use targeted computerized training in cognitive remediation, and this is one of the methods that we would use to try to promote improvements in cognitive abilities and reduce disability. So these activities tend to be drill and practice exercises that are activating neural circuitry that we know are impaired across a range of different neuropsychiatric conditions. The activities tend to be relatively easy to start with. You might have 2 items that you need to sort into one category or another, and then over time there are maybe six different categories that you could sort these items into and 2 of them aren't even named, so you have to guess what they are and then use working memory to remember what they are. A lot of different ways to stimulate cognitive abilities for people who are often avoiding cognitive challenges in their daily lives. The activities are titrated in difficulty. So if a person is on level 6, they won't make it to level 7 until they have 2 consecutive trials of 80% or better. If they come back 2 weeks later and they have a trial below 70%, the computer adjusts the difficulty to match where they are at that time. And there's a lot of evidence that this kind of cognitive activation does work if we define working as changing cognition. We don't see a lot of evidence that only using these procedures has any change in a person's everyday life. So this is my one allotted slide from psychosis that I asked Gustavo if I could talk a little bit about, just use one slide. These are from a study in schizophrenia. I always tell my students, don't ever say that there's no effect, right? It's just not statistically significant. But here we have no effect, an effect of 0. For role functioning, when people did 40 hours of independent training on a cognitive training task, really nice improvements in cognitive abilities, an actual small, very small reduction in quality of life, and no change at all in how they functioned in daily life. So you can stimulate cognition. We showed in a 2-week study of people with psychotic disorders that you show effect sizes just like this in cognition. You can normalize theta activity during a working memory task. You can do all kinds of really nice things for cognition, but these are people who often have long-standing issues with their interpretation of their cognitive abilities and how that that cruel age of onset of our mental disorders, where you start to go off your developmental path and miss opportunities to gain functional skills and to be able to do things in daily life that require cognition. So we need more than just cognitive training. And one other method that we use is called strategic monitoring. Now, you might imagine if I gave you a cognitive exercise right now, and I said, I'd like you to try to remember as many items as you can. And I say, bird, monkey, envelope, tree, house, car. And now I ask you to remember as many of those as you can, quietly to yourself if you'd like. What strategy were you using during that task? That's exactly the answer we get when we do the work with people with depression and people with schizophrenia. So we ask them to engage in a small group by doing targeted cognitive training. We say, so what were you doing when you tried to solve that? And they say things like, I used my memory, or I focused, I concentrated. They don't say things like, well, I recognized that 2 of the items were related to each other, so I kind of clustered those items together and thought about them. Or I told myself a story about a car driving around a tree and into a house, and I made it very elaborate because I know that kind of strategy is going to help me with my memory. It takes weeks and weeks for us to work with people in these environments to have them recognize that A, they're actually using a strategy when they try to solve these cognitive tasks. B, how can I keep track of what strategy I'm using? C, maybe I can switch my strategy if it's not working. And D, I'm going to prepare a strategy given what I know about this kind of task, and if it doesn't work, I'm going to catch it and switch it. Right? So a lot of the problems that we see when it comes to deploying the cognitive skills that people have, even if they have those nice effect size improvements in method 1, a lot of the challenges are, how do you actually apply something now that you're in real life? How do you find a strategy, catch it if it's not working, and switch it? So if that sounds a little bit more like CBT, or another type of psychological intervention, it's because that's where I'm trying to lead you, away from the notion that cognitive remediation is a passive, computer-driven training experience. It's a psychological therapy. And perhaps most realized in that last method is the notion that we want to make sure that people have the opportunity to think about, talk about, and practice how they will use those strategies in a real-life situation. Many cognitive remediation programs include at least about a quarter of the sessions to talk about how people might take what we learned today and set out to achieve the goals that we've established for ourselves. How can we look for a new job and work on our resume and put that application in, given some of the attention and concentration strategies that we developed today? So these are the 3 primary or core methods of cognitive remediation programs. In schizophrenia, we've had a couple of decades now of really nice studies showing that cognitive remediation can improve cognitive abilities and in many cases reduce functioning. In depression, we're still at the early stages in examining whether or not cognitive remediation actually results in changes in everyday behavior. A lot of the early studies you can see is a bit of a mixed bag in terms of small sample sizes, some uncontrolled trials, some people using, everybody using this cognitive activation, but very few people using strategic monitoring or efforts to try to help generalize those approaches to daily life. And mostly good effects on cognitive abilities, but not very much in the way of trying to reduce disability. So you can make the same case from these early cognitive remediation studies in depression that, okay, now we're targeting cognition, but we're still not hitting those first 5 key factors that those with depression have identified as important for their recovery. We did a study the first study I did on cognitive remediation in depression was with people with treatment-resistant depression, and we found, again, nice effects on cognition, but not much movement at all in everyday behavior. And this quote, I think, summarizes a lot of what we see. You know, I know that I improved my cognition improved, but I don't know if I can still do the things I wanted to do. Another quote we had from a program like that was, well, I know the computer made me better, but without that, I don't know if I can actually get better myself. So this kind of external attribution of success that people with depression had. So we kind of retreated back to our lab and said, well, okay, we've got this nice publication, but we didn't really change too many people's lives. They're not functioning, they're not actually going back to work. How can we rethink how we do cognitive remediation in depression? The early stumbling blocks in schizophrenia were, we know we can do cognitive training for TBI and stroke, let's do this in schizophrenia. And it took years to overcome that attempt to directly translate that treatment. And so we said, let's not try to do cognitive remediation just like we have done it in schizophrenia. Let's think about cognition in depression and how these cognitive abilities are going to produce disability and where our treatment targets might be. So this is a model that we've been building and working on with a number of experimental studies in our lab to try to understand cognition as a feedback model. How do these really mild to moderate impairments in depression seem to be related to disability that looks like the person should have 1.5 standard deviation level impairment across these domains? Well, one thing to think about here is we always talk about cognitive data in these group means, right? So we know, I don't even have error bars here, but we know, of course, there's variance in these groups. And we also always think about cognitive data relative to the general population. So whenever you see effect size units for cognition, it's the deviation from the 50th percentile. That based on that person's age and education, where should they be functioning? Should they be remembering 7 or 9 of the 15 words that are read to them? What we very rarely talk about is the degree to which somebody's current cognitive abilities are divergent from their previous or pre-illness cognitive abilities. And so we looked at 109 people with MDD who are at baseline of our cognitive remediation trials. And remember, these are people who are signing up and asking to come in for a 12-week treatment. And about half of them did not have evidence of being neuropsychologically impaired. They were within a standard deviation of normative data on a cognitive composite score. And they didn't have any cognitive domains that were 1 or more standard deviations impaired. So half of the people signing up for cognitive remediation with depression wouldn't be classified as being cognitively impaired. But about half of those who were intact did have what we refer to as idiographic cognitive impairment. In other words, relative to their pre-morbid intellectual functioning, they are now below average. If you're at the 85th percentile before you're ill in your cognitive abilities, and now you're at your 50th percentile, that's not a good thing. People feel that. And you wonder what the degree to which people with depression really feel that. Through that lens of depression, does a loss of cognitive abilities feel so much more than it might actually be from a quantitative perspective? So what we did in this study is also, we administered a role play task to see how well do people actually perform a number of different everyday activities. Can they make plans to recreate in the community? Can they take care of household chores? Can they handle their finances and plan for their medical appointments? And through these role play tasks, we can demonstrate whether or not somebody has intact functional abilities, not necessarily whether they're actually doing these things in daily life, but in the neutral environment of a lab or an office, can they demonstrate they have the skills? We also asked them, how well do you think you did on that task? And we had them rate on a 5-point scale for each of the different subtests. How well do you think you did there? Now, on your left is the performance on this task called the OOPS, so this role play task. And you can see that a person's cognitive abilities, normed based on the general population, is a robust predictor of how well they perform. If I have really good cognitive abilities, I'm going to be able to do everyday tasks better than if I don't have really good cognitive abilities. But when we ask people, how well do you think you did on that task, just after they've done it, actual cognitive abilities are not as strong a predictor as the degree to which a person's current cognition has declined from their pre-morbid cognitive abilities. Right? So I can do things if I'm cognitively well, but if I have declined and I really feel that and recognize it, I might not actually think I did very well. So that has implications for the degree to which these mild cognitive impairments or mild declines in cognition might actually make everyday tasks seem like they're going to be that much harder, either before people do them or after they do them. I don't know if many of you are familiar with some of the work done from Barbara Sahakian's group, where they looked at how people with depression perform both in accuracy, and on the top figure there you can see that people with depression have an accuracy rate on some of these cognitively complex tasks that looks a bit like other neuropsychiatric groups. But if you look at the data trial by trial, so if you have 200 trials of a task, you can look at the probability that somebody makes a mistake immediately after making a mistake. And what they found is a severe elevation only in the depression group, where the likelihood of making a mistake is greatly increased if on the previous trial you made a mistake. Right? And they called this a catastrophic response to failure. So their accuracy is actually not any different, but they're much more likely to be inaccurate consecutively or to keep making a mistake. So in the wake of failure, more failure. So we tested this similarly. If you're familiar with the NBAC test, it's a test that a lot of people, when they take it, will say, please don't ever give me that test again. Because at the 1BAC, which I'm now going to give to you if anyone would like a washroom break before I give large-scale cognitive testing, it's really just an identification task. Can you concentrate and note when you see the same stimulus twice in a row? So I'd like everybody to make their favorite noise, whether you want to stomp your feet, clap your hands, or yell something, whenever you see two numbers appear one after the other. So if you saw 9, 5, 5, that's when you'd make your noise. Everybody got your noise? Okay, this will be fun. And we'll only judge you a little bit. Okay, that's not bad. So what we did is we gave people a visual analog scale after as well. And we asked them, how motivated were you during that task? How frustrated were you? Did you focus, and how anxious were you? And people can indicate on this bar the degree to which they experience those psychological phenomena. Okay? Now you're not going to like me anymore because I'm going to start giving you some challenging cognitive tasks. This is the 2BAC. So now if you see the same number that appeared 2 numbers ago, you make the sound. So 7, 5, 7, 5, 3, no clap. Everybody got it? All right. Wait till we get to 9BAC. No, I'm just kidding. Ready? Here we go. Okay. So there is something called a standardized testing environment, and this is not it. So I won't, well, but you can imagine, like, people with depression are going to react differently once the cognitive load increases. So really quickly, just the 3BAC, just for fun for today. So now it has to be the same number that appeared 3 numbers ago. Everybody concentrating? Okay. Okay. Like we said, we won't judge you. The camera's pointed at me. You'll be fine. So interestingly, what we saw was in an isolated environment where you're not laughing and others aren't around you, it's not really that hard to do the 1 back or the 2 back. And we didn't find any difference as you go from a cognitive load of 1, which is really just very short-term working memory, to a higher cognitive load of 2 back. People with depression only had a deviation from healthy controls as you went from 2 back to 3 back, not 1 back to 2 back. Right, so you don't really see the manifestation of working memory impairments until you really amp up the cognitive load in depression. But what we saw was on that VAS scale, when we asked people about their motivation, their frustration, and the degree to which they want to disengage from the task, we're seeing not a catastrophic response to failure, but a catastrophic response in spite of success. People with depression are hanging right with the control group from 1 back to 2 back, but they don't know how the control group performs. They just know that was harder, and I don't think I did as well. And so they self-report anxiety, loss of focus, loss of motivation, even though they're doing exactly what we would expect based on performance that we see in healthy comparison subjects. So what happens when we see those kind of phenomena if we disengage with tasks because it's this much of a cognitive impairment, but the tasks feel this much harder, and now we start to avoid tasks, because tasks that feel really hard when you have depression are things that you tend to avoid. We found this in a similar task called the PACEAT, which I won't administer to you today, but this is a serial addition task that is also very frustrating. And we looked at the number of items that people skipped. So again, disengagement from the task for people with higher BDI scores manifested as you went from low difficulty to high difficulty on this task. This is my PhD student, Tanya Tran, who did a modification of Treadway's reward processing tasks. If people are familiar with the Treadway task, it's a very well-known paradigm to study, an experimental way to study anhedonia. So in the physical effort task, if you just put your hands on the table and you tap with your dominant hand index finger as fast as you can, it's pretty, go ahead and do that. You see how easy it is, right? Your dominant hand index finger, and then your non-dominant hand pinky finger. And it's kind of annoying, isn't it? It's harder to do that. It's harder to tap with your, so Treadway has this task where he simply asks people to choose, do you want to get a higher reward for doing the harder task? You want to get more money, more reward. You can get more reward if you choose the non-dominant pinky. People with depression will choose the index finger even though it's associated with less reward. So Tanya modified the NBAC to see whether or not we see a similar type of cognitive avoidance effort, not just physical effort avoidance, in depression. And so what she found, replicating a lot of other work, is that anhedonia severity was associated with the likelihood of choosing the the severity with the harder task, right? So, sorry, let me reword that. So more anhedonia, higher likelihood of choosing the easier task, right? So what we found, though, is that the motivation to expend cognitive effort, choosing 2 back instead of 1 back, like you've just done, is a mediator of the relationship between cognitive ability and actual functional impairments in daily life. So in depression, it's not just that mild to moderate cognitive impairment, it's the way that makes tasks feel harder, and it's the degree to which people then further choose to avoid cognitive effort and probably decreasing their confidence to use their cognitive abilities. So again, can't just put them in front of a computer and say, good luck, hope the cognitive training works. We've got all these other variables that are going to interact. And just quickly, we find something similar here, that lower self-efficacy to do cognitive tasks is predicting functional disability in depression. So this is where we're coming to, again, go back to the basics and say to ourselves, how can we best apply cognitive remediation to those with depression? And we did this really fun study called Brain of Thrones, where we're asking the question, do people with depression, if they choose their own task, if they choose their own mission in cognitive remediation, are they going to give themselves a good enough workout? Are they going to actually do something that is cognitively stimulating and challenging enough that it's going to produce some sort of positive effects? So this task is just set up a lot like many cognitive remediation tasks. On the very easy level, they have to look at their shield. This is a shield where your allies are on the battlefield. Here's the map of the battlefield. Where were your allies? You're not really expected to make mistakes on this, but we wanted to know, given people do 10 trials of each difficulty level, given how you did on those 10 trials at difficulty level 11, what would you like to do next? Would you like to go right back to trial 11, go up by 10 difficulty levels, or go down by 10 difficulty levels? On the really challenging tasks, here's your shield, here's the map, where was your shield? So again, kind of look, I mean, there are 10 difficulty levels in between, 9 in between, 8 in between, sorry. So again, we wanted to see, do people actually adjust? And we lumped the easiest 5 and the hardest 5 together and looked at performance. Now here, surprisingly to us, people with depression actually perform just as well as the control group, even on the really hard trials. When we got to trials 9 and 10, there started to be a little bit of a difference, but not very meaningful. How many do you think you got correct? So here we see an effect for people with depression, believing they got fewer correct than they actually did. And probably most importantly, what do you want to do next, now that you've done training at this difficulty level? Healthy individuals and people with depression on the easy trials said, yeah, let's take it up a notch. This can be a little bit harder for me, I can handle it. The healthy controls on the really hard trials essentially said, give me another chance, right? 0 would be staying at about the same level you were then. Whereas people with depression said, oh, take me down on average 3.5 difficulty levels. So that might be a good thing for some people if it truly is too hard, but what we're seeing again is they're not actually performing any worse than our control participants. They're just perceiving that they're performing worse, and behaviorally, they're making a choice to avoid that cognitive challenge. So again, evidence, I think, that if you give people a tablet, sign them up for a prescription to cognitive training to do on their own, we don't have a lot of confidence that people with depression are going to go after that cognitive challenge in that isolated environment. And so if this is all leading to understimulation in daily life, that's bad for brain. And we can see that possibly feeding back in to these mild to moderate cognitive impairments that we know about in depression. And so we developed a new type of remediation, cognitive remediation, to try to really address a lot of those different factors. We call it action-based cognitive remediation because it involves many more activities during the treatment and a lot of behavioral activation approaches to try to find ways for people to go out into their daily lives and go after those cognitive challenges that they typically avoid. We also liked the acronym of ABCR, so that's how we landed on action-based cognitive remediation. We did an initial trial. We've just finished an RCT. The data aren't quite ready yet. But we did an initial trial comparing ABCR versus the traditional cognitive remediation that I told you about earlier, with those 3 methods of computer training, discussions of strategy, and talking about how you might use everyday activities to reach your goals. In ABCR, one of the biggest differences was we had an initial and 5 goal-setting sessions throughout to make sure that we were clearly linking cognitive abilities to that person's individual goals. And after people did the cognitive training on the computer, they stood up and turned around and engaged those strategies that they used with props and role plays that mimicked everyday tasks. So it's hard to interpret what these are. In the upper right corner is a social cognition task, so where can you focus your attention to be able to identify the emotions that others are experiencing. And we have lots of different tasks related to work or independent functioning. This is a task called Everyone's Out Sick Today, and you show up for your job at a hardware store and everyone's out sick, so your boss says you've got to rotate between these 3 stations, and each of the stations has a very different type of task. It's either conceptual reasoning, set shifting flexibility in your approach to solving the task, or simply memorizing some information. We've got real-world living tasks like being able to plan a recreational outing. And you have this amount of money, this amount of time, and you're taking your friend and your friend's cousin, and this young man wants a really thrilling experience. So here's a thrill rating for each of these rides. Now, you've got 3 things to juggle. What are the strategies we used in today's executive functioning task? that you might be able to apply here. So the action-based part here is standing up and using your strategies instead of simply talking about how you might use them. We're talking about people with attention, memory, and executive functioning impairments. We don't want them to have to remember 6 months later and abstract to some new environment how they can apply those strategies. They're doing it in real time. So our results here suggested that both groups improved in cognition. This is a T-score. So T-scores have an average of 10, standard deviation, average of 50, standard deviation of 10. This is a relatively cognitively impaired group to begin with, and that both groups showed improvements in cognition over time. No differences. Remember, they're both getting the cognitive stimulation, cognitive training with the computers. But when we looked at functional abilities, this is going back to that set of role-play tasks I showed you earlier, where you have to plan your finances, schedule appointments, and plan outings in the community. Here we see an effect, and perhaps even a sleeper effect, from end of treatment to durability, where those in the ABCR group had improved demonstration of their capacity to function. And I love some of the quotes that we're getting from people in this type of treatment where they're really talking not just about cognition, they're talking about how they use their cognition and might not avoid cognitive challenges in daily life. The other quote that I don't have here today, which is one of my favorite, is, oh no, I think I have it later, never mind. Spoiler alert. So, in addition to better functional abilities, we also found better retention in this study. These are really hard groups to run. Anybody who's done clinical trials knows that recruitment and retention are incredibly challenging issues. And cognitive remediation is no different. We often see somewhere between 30 and 45% attrition rates over a 12-week trial. Here we found more retention in ABCR compared to traditional cognitive remediation programs. And I think that the goal setting aspect probably has a big part to do with that. We also know that you can ignore p-values because they don't matter anymore in today's era of effect sizes, especially when one of your primary hypotheses doesn't quite cross the p.05 threshold. But we found a trend, if we can say that, toward more people working in 3 to 6 months following ABCR compared to those who got traditional cognitive remediation. So I think one of the lessons that we've learned is when you're trying to enhance cognition in depression, what we have to focus on is much more than just those pure cognitive abilities. We have to think about the lens through which people interpret and internalize their own cognitive challenges. How much in their behavior in daily lives are they avoiding going after those cognitive challenges, and how do you find a way to interrupt that? So this is my favorite quote. This might sound crazy, but it wasn't until I saw my hands in front of me doing the role plays that I realized I can still be good at things. And he further said, all day, I realized that since I had my first episode of depression, I never see my hands anymore. I sit at home like this. And when I was on the computer, I couldn't see my hands, the computer was doing the tasks. When you made me stand up and do things, I realized, wow, I can actually do something. It reminds me of my kids when they play with Legos, and they snap 2 pieces of Lego together, and it seems like the most amazing thing anyone has ever done. They get so excited about it. They get that tangible and tactile and auditory, visual feedback from actually engaging with something that is a cognitive challenge for them. And I think when we talk about cognitive remediation and trying to move that into a recovery for people with depression, we have to make sure that they get exactly that kind of feedback as well. So I think we've got multiple ways that we can think about if cognition plays a pivotal role in producing disability and sustaining disability for people with depression, where can we try to find a point to enter that equation and disrupt this feedback cycle? So I want to thank my team for all the work they're doing. A lot of the experimental studies that I showed you today in the lab have been master's and PhD theses from my team. And if you're interested, there are a couple of nice resources. Another disclosure, that's my book, if you'd like to buy it. And there are a couple of websites where you can find some materials. CogSmart in particular is quite nice for family members and for people with psychiatric illness who are experiencing and trying to understand their cognitive deficits, as well as a free online resource from Alice Medalia's group as well. So I'll thank everybody there for your attention. A great job on the NBAC task, by the way. Okay.